Welcome back, everyone, to my guest bedroom slash office. Same Dr. Jam, same dog in the background. In this video, I'm going to deliver what would have been the lecture content of my first class this week, specifically on the date of the resurrection and why it matters for larger questions of the spread of Christianity in the 4th century Roman Empire. If you haven't yet watched my administrative video, the sort of one talking about our upcoming game session and its mechanics, you might want to start there, but to each their own. Maybe you want to kind of just dive into the lecture content right away, and if so, you're in the right place. In today's lecture, I really have two key goals to try to teach you about. The first is to emphasize some of the timekeeping systems in the ancient world and how differences between the way that Jews keep time and the way that Romans keep time sort of set the controversy over the date of the resurrection. But the second, and I think even more important point, is to emphasize to you that the fight about when to set the date of Jesus' resurrection is not just a fight about a date. It also encapsulates a much larger controversy about who should 4th century Christians be thinking about when they plan their holidays. Holidays are a really important part of timekeeping structure in any society. Think about the fact for you that we have Christmas break, whether or not you celebrate Christianity, right? We have the 4th of July, which is, sort of an organizing principle of the summer. We have Halloween, for which candy companies have overtaken the entire month of October, right? When we set the dates of holidays has a really big impact on how we sort of structure our thinking and our lives within the year. And so as Christians debated being able to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus openly, publicly, trying to figure out a central set time became critical to their efforts to spread Christianity both east and west within the empire. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. I first want to start by just pinning down the key dates of Jesus' resurrection. We know from the Gospels that Jesus was crucified at the time of Passover in the city of Jerusalem, right? Palm Sunday is the Sunday a week before his resurrection when he proceeds into the city of Jerusalem on a donkey. On the Thursday before Passover, he has the final supper. Friday, known as Good Friday, is the date of his crucifixion. Saturday is the day when his beloved, followers mourn him. And then Sunday, of course, is the day when the women go to the tomb and discover his body is missing. So we have a kind of Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday setup, which is all built itself around Passover. Now, Passover is worshipped on the same day of the Jewish calendar, which is the 15th day of the month of Nisan. The Hebrew people had developed their own calendar system, which is quite different from the Roman world. But actually, it was Jews and Babylonians who came up with the idea of the 7-day week, right? You see that even in Genesis, right? And on the 7th day, God rested. Romans didn't have a sense of a 7-day calendar, so early Christianity tended to follow the Jewish calendar of worshiping Jesus's Last Supper, death, and resurrection along the sort of the Jewish timekeeping procedures. We can see a little bit of evidence of that within the Gospels themselves. So just to recap, we know Jesus is condemned and crucified during the celebration of Passover. We know this because the Gospels tell us. And Passover is sort of the week-long celebration that takes place for us usually in the months of March and April. Now, according to Mark, and remember we think Mark is probably our earliest Gospel writer, he says, "Now the Passover and festival of unleavened bread were only 2 days away. And the chief priests and teachers of the law were scheming to arrest Jesus and secretly kill him. But not during the festival, they said, or the people may riot." So Mark, as our first gospel writer, is pretty unambiguous about when exactly this takes place, right? That the death and the resurrection of Jesus needs to be linked to Passover. And even at the time of Jesus' own lifetime, his persecutors are thinking about the sort of religious and political implications. Would it be bad to kill him during this festival, season and holiday? How might that provoke outrage? Boy, were they ever right about that. We also see similar evidence that Jesus's death is linked to Passover in the Gospel of Matthew, which again we think is kind of in the second generation along with Luke. In Matthew 26, he says, when Jesus had finished saying all these things, he said to his disciples, "As you know, Passover is 2 days away, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified." So once again, we get a similar detail here from Matthew that Caiaphas and the other priests are scheming to kill Jesus, but they are worried about it overlapping a little bit with the Passover festival itself. Not worried enough not to do it though, because of course we know that Jesus is crucified on Good Friday. So, from a purely gospel-based standpoint, there really isn't any wiggle room for arguing about when the date of Jesus' death and resurrection should be celebrated. According to the Gospels, who were written by men either who were still raised in the sort of Jewish tradition or closely affiliated with the Jewish tradition, Jesus' death and resurrection really overlap with Passover and should therefore be celebrated with that overlapping. So that's the first point to hold in your head. If you want to be purely accurate, if you want to focus purely on the technical details of the Gospels, not a lot of wiggle room, Jesus' death and Passover are one. Okay, I want to dig in just a little bit to some of the symbolic relevance of Passover itself and why it mattered for Jesus' earliest followers. Passover really is perhaps the most important of the holiday of the Jewish faith at this time. It's funny, those of us who are practicing Christians tend to equate Hanukkah and Christmas and like, oh, that's the big holiday. But most of my Jewish friends will tell me like, no, actually Hanukkah isn't that important in comparison to Passover or other holidays, right? Passover is really perhaps the most memorable gathering of Jews in the ancient world, but also in the diaspora. Now, in case you don't know as much about the Old Testament, and I certainly have a lot to learn myself, Passover is an important holiday because it marks the liberation of the Hebrew slaves from Egypt. If you've ever seen that movie, The Prince of Egypt, or even the old Exodus, I think with Paul Newman, you'll remember, of course, that this is when the Hebrew people are kept as servants or slaves of the Egyptians, and that it is Moses who comes to liberate them out of Egypt, right? That's the book of Exodus. Now, in the process of trying to liberate the Hebrews from Egypt, Moses sort of summons the plagues of God, right? There's the pestilence, there's the river, the Nile running with blood. But the final pestilence or the final plague that God sends upon the Egyptians is the spirit of death. And this spirit of death will go throughout all the households of Egypt and will kill the firstborn son, right? Which is a real blow to any family, to have your eldest boy die. Now, in order for the Hebrew people to be protected, right, because Moses didn't want to kill the firstborn Jewish boys, the Hebrew people were instructed by Moses to paint the blood of a lamb over their doorway so that quite literally the spirit, right, the deathly spirit would pass over their homes and not kill their children. That's where the word Passover comes from, right, the passing over of the spirit. And the Hebrew people would thereafter celebrate this holiday on the 15th day of Nisan year after year to commemorate the fact that God passed over their homes and in so doing managed to liberate them from slavery in Egypt, right? That becomes pretty critical. Now, the notion of passing over and the blood of the lamb also becomes very much implicated within Jesus' own story, because Jesus' followers were not dummies. They recognized that the fact that Jesus died during perhaps the most sacred holiday of the Jewish calendar gave them a real opportunity to communicate the message of their Messiah in conjunction with this holiday. And so for this reason, one of the ways that the earliest Christians would try to communicate their faith to their Jewish brothers was to say, Jesus is the Lamb, right? And the Passover requires you to slaughter a lamb to commemorate the lamb's blood that was painted on the doorways. And the early followers of Christ said, yes, he is the Lamb, right? And they linked Christianity and Judaism in this way. This really comes through clearly in John 1. John, remember, is the latest of our gospel writers. And he says, look, the Lamb of the God who takes away the sin of the world. And therefore, the Lamb becomes this sort of combination symbol. It both draws upon the old Hebrew traditions of Exodus, but it also brings in the new traditions of Christianity. And Jesus as the Lamb of God, whose blood must be shed for us to be saved, was very much a symbol intended to weave those two traditions together. All right, so for all of you guys, those of you who in your character sheets, it says you should support linking the celebration of the death of Christ or the resurrection with Passover. I've just given you a whole arsenal of evidence, right? Evidence that both in terms of symbolism and in terms of accuracy to the Gospels, Jesus' resurrection should be linked with the Jewish calendar rather than any sort of alternatives. And indeed, if we look at the sort of map and the traditions of the first century of the Roman Empire, what we can see is that there's relatively close agreement in that first 100 years after Jesus' death that the Resurrection Sunday should be celebrated always on the third day of Passover. It would become known as Pascha. And because Christianity was so concentrated in the eastern half of the Roman Empire in those first 100 years, it really wove together nicely. There was a big population of Jewish people in Alexandria, in Jerusalem, in Roman Syria, Antioch, and Damascus. All these places where you see these big sort of red bubbles, except for Rome, this is where there were large numbers of Jews and a growing number of Christians. And so linking Passover with the resurrection of Jesus made it really easy for the first evangelist to say, yes, Passover is really important and we should celebrate it, but we should also be celebrating it in conjunction with the resurrection of Christ. Where that messaging will begin to break down, however, is as Christianity spreads outside of the Jewish world and into the Western Roman Empire. I want to be clear, there's no doubt that there are Jewish people in Rome and elsewhere, but not in these heavily concentrated diaspora communities to the same extent that they are in Egypt and Syria. And so when early Christians begin teaching in Rome, what they quickly find is that the sort of message of Jesus as the Lamb of God, or the sort of Passover spring lamb, that isn't as helpful. It's just not nearly as meaningful in the western part of the Roman Empire because your average Roman doesn't get it, right? They don't know much about Judaism. They tend to think that the Jewish people are a strange sect of monotheists. And so Christians working in Rome and Gaul and Spain and North Africa, they have to come up with a different strategy for organizing their calendar. And that calendar is going to align with the Roman one. Okay, I've been talking here for about 13 minutes, and I know sometimes people's brains can get a little fuzzy, so I might encourage you here to take just like a 2 or 3 minute break, put me on pause, and then when you're ready, go ahead and come back to some of the more Roman content. Okay, if I haven't lost you yet, or maybe you got a good stretch in, you can hear my dog groaning in the background. We'll go ahead and try to think a little bit about if linking it to Judaism, Passover, the Passover lamb worked in the East, what was it that was working in the West, in Rome and beyond? In order to explain that, we have to back up just a little bit to talk about Roman timekeeping, which is really different even from our method of timekeeping, and also very different from the timekeeping calendars of the East. Okay, first to preface, we should say that the concept we have today of a 7-day week is not Roman at all. The 7-day week concept really comes from Babylon and Judea. Really, the Eastern astronomers were much better than the Romans at timekeeping, and the Roman calendar was inaccurate to the point that it had to be corrected every 100 or years so with like an extra month. Now, the Roman calendar, though, did have month names that are more recognizable to us. So July is named July for Julius Caesar, August for Augustus, And the Romans basically divided up their months according to 3 days within that. The calends, this by the way is where we get the word calendar, that's the first of the month. That's usually when bills are due. You have your nones, which is kind of the middle marker of the month, and then the ides, which is usually the 14th, 15th. And the Ides are famous, of course, for the death of Julius Caesar. The Ides of, beware the Ides of March. You don't need to memorize that. Just a fun fact in case you've heard that term before. Now, the Roman timekeeping system could be a little complicated. So the main way that people in Rome or other Roman-controlled cities maintained their concept of time was a big public calendar in the forum that usually a slave or a bureaucrat had to update daily. So you knew when your bills were coming due, you knew what day of the week you were in, mostly because the Roman state had a sort of big chart that you could follow, as opposed to the Jewish calendar, which sort of had the 7 days cycle that you could follow along week by week. Now, I remember when I was your age and I first learned that Romans didn't have a 7-day a week, I thought to myself, oh my God, they don't have a weekend. What must it have been like to live in a world where there wasn't a weekend? But I really want to emphasize, don't feel too bad for the Romans. They had so many different religious holidays because of their polytheistic society that some historians estimate that somewhere between 20 to 30% of the days in the Roman calendar were sort of set aside as no business for religious reasons, which is wild to me. Can you imagine like 1 out of every 3 or 1 out of every 4 days being a sort of religious holiday? I guess it depended if you wanted to worship that god or if you needed to find work. And so the Roman calendar is just littered with worships for Aphrodite, for Zeus, for Juno, for Mithras, for the Egyptian goddess Isis. And, depending on your religious affiliations, you could also be worshiping the emperor's birthday. There's all sorts of political reasons to add new holidays. Although this can really seem like a menagerie of different holidays and dates, like how did anybody keep all of this stuff in their head? One way that Romans did organize time, especially in the Western Roman Empire, was according to the astrological movements of the sun. This is very common. You even see it in sort of indigenous American populations in ancient Egypt, because the sun cycles and the astronomy is one of the sort of shared mechanisms that everyone can see and measure with sundials or other timekeeping measures. And so in order to think about how to structure their holidays over seasons and time, one of the ways that Romans and other Western imperial people did this was to align major holidays with the solstices and the equinoxes. So a solstice, which is based on the word sol, which means sun in Latin, the solstice is the time when you're going to get the most and the least sunlight in the year. So our Christmas, for example, is mostly aligned with the winter solstice, right? The shortest day of the year. The Romans had a big blowout party called the Saturnalia. The Saturnalia was usually celebrated sometimes between the 17th and the 20th of December, close to our Christmas. It was the shortest day of the year. The Romans worshipped Saturn, the father of Zeus, and it was kind of like a topsy-turvy day in which I think like their version of Christmas is that slaves got to be the masters for the day. Women literally got to sort of wear the pants around the house. And from that is where we get our Christmas date, because it so closely aligns with that solstice. It was easy to convert people. More important for our purposes, though, is the equinox and how that will relate to the resurrection of Christ. An equinox literally means equal night, and an equinox is the sort of quarterly timekeeping measures in which daytime and nighttime are exactly equal in balance, right? When there's an equal number of hours when the sun is up and the sun is down. There is always an equinox in the spring and always an equinox in the fall. And it is at these moments of equal time that Romans also have big holidays, usually to celebrate the sort of rebudding of plant life, right? Like the outgrowth of flowers or springtime, or in the fall celebrating the harvest, right? When things are beginning to die and we sort of pick the fruit from our crops to enjoy. So what we clearly are seeing in the Roman world is that there's so many holidays for different gods, polytheistic traditions, but that the organizing principle has to do with the movement of the sun, right? The days of least sunlight, the days of most sunlight, and the days when sun and dark are equal. So we have a kind of four-part calendar: shortest day of the year, spring equinox; longest day of the year, fall equinox. And that is how you can kind of cluster and coordinate the worship of your divinities. All right, now that I have discussed both the sort of Jewish timekeeping system and the Roman timekeeping system, I now want to dive into our particular 4th century context and why the date of the resurrection is a bit of a challenge for someone like Constantine or other 4th century bishops who are trying to coordinate the calendar, coordinate belief systems, and also expand the church. If we put ourselves into the shoes of someone like Constantine at the Council of Nicaea, he's really facing a little bit of a difficult dilemma here, right? On the one hand, he has bishops from the East telling him, no, we need to keep the resurrection linked to Passover. It's the way we've always done it. It's the way our Eastern Christians worship it. And it is most accurate to the Gospels, right? There's no ambiguity. Mark and Matthew and others say, Jesus is the Lamb. He was crucified during the Passover celebrations in Judea. On the other hand, Constantine is going to have other bishops, perhaps like Osius or Augustine, who are from the West, who say, I know what the Gospels say, but if we really want to expand our religion to pagans, right, to people who are not Christians, what we need to do is to try to integrate the holidays of Christianity with the holidays that people are already celebrating. And therefore, we know that in the springtime, pagans are already worshiping a number of fertility gods for the spring equinox. Why don't we position the story of Jesus' resurrection along with that equinox, right? To say that, yes, springtime, March, this is the month of renewal and rebirth, and therefore we will celebrate the resurrection of Jesus, right? It's a pretty clever marketing tactic if you're thinking about trying to reach pagans, because pagans are already worshiping goddesses like Demeter, goddesses like Cybele, right? A mother goddess, goddesses like Aphrodite during the springtime when things are beginning to grow and bloom again. Why not put Jesus and Christianity's core holiday of resurrection right into that mix, right into the messaging? And that, my friends, is how you get a bit of an East-West controversy over when the resurrection should be. Do you stay more faithful to your roots, or do you think about strategizing beyond? So this division between more Passover or more equinox really is going to be a sort of critical dividing line between the Eastern and Western Roman Empire. And one thing that I'm interested in our game session is to see how it divides people even within factions, because both factions have people from the West and both factions have people from the East. If you're a bishop from the West, there's a pretty decent chance that, or North Africa, that you are going to lean more towards the spring equinox because you understand the challenges of having to convert a more pagan populace. But if you're from the East, if you're from Alexandria or from Jerusalem or from Antioch, there's probably a decent chance you're going to lean more towards Passover because that's how your church has always done it. And so the core question for Constantine and for all of you is, which half of the empire is it more important to keep happy? The people who have done things a certain way because that's the way it's always been done, or those who are trying to branch out and beyond? Our reading for today's class, there were two of them, but the bigger one was the Zerubbabel reading. And what he points out is that there's actually a fairly long history of the Western world. Specifically, I mean Rome and Gaul and Spain, these places trying to force the Eastern cities and the Eastern bishops to do things their way. On page 285, he talks about how Bishop of Rome Victor I tried to pass a canon in 190 CE that we were going to align Easter with the equinox and that we were going to follow along with a more Western way of doing things. And because Victor was really throwing his weight around, he just sort of said, that's it, I'm going to excommunicate anyone who doesn't do it the Western way. We also see on page 287 where Zerubbabel talks about how Constantine himself may have actually written a letter or given a speech saying that it's unworthy for Christians to have to keep linking their religion to Judaism, right? It is unworthy that we should follow the practice of the Jews. Let us then have nothing in common with the detestable Jewish crowd. If this seems anti-Semitic to you, it is, right? It's an attempt by Westerners to kind of say, Eastern Christianity is too Jewish. We really need to break off from Passover. We need to break off from the Jews, and we need to create our own calendar that's going to speak to more Western interests or Western values. At the core, therefore, of this resurrection debate is a larger question of Christianity and of Judaism. We really see these two worlds, which have been in collaboration, now coming into conflict. And it might be symptomatic of a larger debate of what's going on in Christianity at this time. Does the Christian church still need its Jewish roots, or is it time to break off, right? Is it time to create a new faith in a new empire, which is more Western focused and more Roman centric? And each of you will have your own sort of approach to that very question. Now, in order to get you ready for our fourth game session, I'm really coming to the end of my lecture here. And I want to encourage you, before you come to class, to practice writing out some of how you think your character would approach these questions of East versus West, Christian versus Judaism, Passover versus equinox. And so if you would, put me on pause for a minute. Take about 2 minutes and jot down all the reasons you can think for keeping Christianity really connected to its Jewish roots. I'm going to pause here. Myself, I'll be quiet for about 30 seconds, and then we'll resume. Okay, I hope you took those 2 minutes. I now want to encourage you to do kind of the opposite exercise and think about what are 2 minutes that you can think of for the reasoning of why we might want to distance Christianity from its Jewish roots, right? What might be helpful to early Christians if they sort of break away from the Jewish calendar? Once again, take about 2 minutes. Okay, I'm going to assume you took all 4 minutes like a good student. Fantastic. I promise, if you're planning to skip over this exercise, it really will help. What I now want to do is share with you my own sort of pros and cons list that I can think of as a historian in my head. And I think the core things that come out to me is that the main reasons for keeping Jesus' resurrection linked to Judaism and Passover have to do with theology, right? There's really no doubt in the New Testament that Jesus was a Jewish man raised in the temple. He came to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover. And furthermore, that the very idea of a Messiah, of Jesus as Messiah, that's a Jewish concept. It comes straight out of the Old Testament. And of course, we know, even in our Council of Nicaea, that many Christians still very much read and honor the Old Testament as a core part of the faith tradition. So on the one hand, you can make a pretty good case that the resurrection and Passover are linked for theological reasons. And you can't just throw them out. Otherwise, you're kind of throwing out the entire Judaism within Christ's own story. On the other hand, most of the reasons that we can see for breaking off the resurrection from Passover are political. Right now in history, the people that Christians need to convert are not the Jews, but they're pagans, right? They're Greeks and they're Romans, polytheists. Most of the Jewish people who are going to convert to Christianity already have. So where we need as a church to build inroads is not with Jewish people, but with pagan people. We also can think of the fact that Jewish elites at this time were blamed for persecuting the Christians, right? It was Caiaphas who pursued Jesus. It was another high priest who killed James the Just. There's lots of political arguments for why Judaism needs to be broken off from the faith tradition. We also know that the Jewish people have a long history of rebelling against or standing against Roman rule. Do we necessarily want sort of Jewish rebels within the Christian faith tradition? If Constantine is trying to link church and state, they might not go together so well. Also, for our game session, we might want to think about how these debates speak to the larger fringes of Ebionites and Marcionites. It should be no surprise to you that Ebionites will want to support both Christianity and Judaism being together, of resurrection and Passover being linked. Marcionites, on the other hand, want to separate the Jews and the Christians, right? They believe Jesus is an entirely different God from the old Hebrew God, and so they will lean more in the direction of the West and try to center resurrection on an equinox. So we're kind of bringing the fringes, we're bringing politics, we're bringing theology and history all to bear on this one debate. I'm going to close with this last slide by emphasizing that wherever your character stands, what you need to kind of keep in the back of your mind is that this debate about resurrection and debate is not just about theology. It's really also about politics and history. Are we going to keep it as Passover to honor our older roots, or are we going to link it with the solstice to think about reaching out beyond the Roman East, beyond the Jewish community? Some of you may not have a strong view either way, but understanding it as a political and historical debate might give you more clarity about which way to go. Wherever you stand and however you come down on the issues, I think the key takeaway I want you to know is that the resurrection date is more than just about the calendar. It's about the shape of the early Christian church as it tries to bridge the gap between state and personal belief. All right, hope this helped, and I will see you guys in our second class this week. Have a good one.